My name is Major General Marshall Reed, 37 years old, Army Cyber Command, multiple commendations, ribbons earned through sweat and silence. But tonight, I was just the soldier in the corner. That's what it felt like. Anyway, my shoes were polished to regulation shine, my charcoal gray suit pressed clean enough to slice the air, and yet no one seemed to see me. Not truly. Not at the wedding of Bryce Grayson, my brother-in-law and the crown prince of the Grayson dynasty. The ballroom was decked in extravagance, gold-trimmed chairs, floral arrangements flown in from Chile, a string quartet playing some pretentious arrangement I couldn't name. Everyone there sparkled. Champagne shimmered in fluted glasses. Waiters in crisp white vests danced between tables that glittered with name cards written in calligraphy. All except mine. My table was in the far back, near the swinging kitchen doors. You could hear the metallic clatter of pots and the hiss of steam every time a server pushed through. The name card on my table read Marshall R. Not even my full name. Not even a major. No title, no acknowledgement. I was seated beside Jasmine's distant cousin, who clearly had no idea who I was and spent most of the evening texting someone about an after-party in Soho. 2 empty seats flanked me, like I had brought shame as my +2. I didn't look for Jasmine. I knew where she was. At the head table, next to Bryce and the rest of the family. Laughing, toasting, radiant in her pearl-dusted dress, surrounded by people who beamed when she spoke and barely noticed when I breathed. The first sting came when Bryce's business partner gave his toast. He mentioned the legacy of brilliance in the Grayson bloodline. Said Bryce was the future of American innovation. Applause rang out like fireworks. Then he turned toward the cake, wheeled in like a trophy on a mirrored cart. 5 layers, sculpted edges, sugar roses. One of the groomsmen, already tipsy, shouted out over the music, "That's a $12,000 cake." Laughter followed, lighthearted, except what came next wasn't. Another voice, a little sharper, a little more smug, cut through the laughter. Doubt a soldier could afford that. And then came Jasmine. My wife. My Jasmine. She didn't defend me, didn't roll her eyes or scold them for the insult. She leaned forward, glass in hand, and said with a smile that could slice skin, "When will a soldier ever afford a cake like this?" Her voice carried, like she wanted it to, like she needed the room to hear. And they did. You could feel the chuckles slither through the crowd like smoke. A few people at nearby tables turned to look at me, not in sympathy, in amusement, like I was the punchline everyone forgot to laugh at earlier. I didn't say a word. I didn't stand. Didn't clink my glass or shout or storm out like some wounded animal. I just sat there, one hand resting on the back of the chair, the other curled around the stem of a water glass that suddenly felt too heavy. My jaw was tight, not from anger, but from how much I had to hold back. Because if I said even one thing, it would come out like a battlefield. And this wasn't the time. Or maybe it was. But I was too used to swallowing things. Too used to disappearing when it was inconvenient for people to see me fully. The music started again. A slow violin piece. Couples danced. Jasmine didn't glance in my direction once. I watched her twirl with Bryce during the sibling dance. Her smile was wide, her body relaxed, as if nothing cruel had passed her lips earlier. As if I didn't exist in the same room, let alone her life. Someone brushed by me, one of the servers, and whispered, "Sorry, sir," as they passed. And oddly enough, that was the only time that night I felt acknowledged. By a stranger carrying dirty plates. The smell of the food, the perfume, the distant laughter, it all blurred into a haze. But inside me, something shifted. Something subtle but irrevocable. A tightening of gears. A flick of a switch. I had been overlooked before. I'd been the shadow in the corner of family gatherings, the name skipped when introductions were made, the man Jasmine's family never brought up unless they needed a safe story to impress someone patriotic. But tonight wasn't just about feeling invisible. Tonight made me feel disposable. What they didn't know, what Jasmine had clearly forgotten, or chosen to ignore, was that I had never needed their approval. I had faced harder men in sandstorms, made decisions that shaped global outcomes, and carried secrets no one in that ballroom could imagine. My silence was not weakness. It was armor. But something in that moment cracked. Not loudly. Just enough to let in the cold. I stayed through dessert. Ate none of it. Just stirred the whipped cream with my spoon while the toast continued. Jasmine kissed Bryce on the cheek and gave him a framed photo of their childhood. She didn't come over to me. Not once. Not until the music began to fade and the guests started drifting out. Even then, she didn't meet my eyes. She posed for photos near the flower wall with her cousins and her father. Randall, the man who once called my promotion cute. Bryce, the same man who told Jasmine I'd never earn real money in a uniform. They all smiled like royalty. When the night ended, I didn't walk to Jasmine's side. I walked to the valet, handed them my ticket, climbed into my car in silence. Jasmine could find her own way home, and she did. Hours later, without a single text to ask if I'd made it back. She had her family, her glittering throne, her spotlight. And me? I had a dashboard soaked in silence, a steering wheel grip tight in calloused palms, and a mind that had finally decided it had taken enough. Something had shifted. Not broken. Not yet. But shifted. Like tectonic plates under pressure. And I knew, when it moved again, it wouldn't be quiet. The mansion sat like a crown on the hill, polished, proud, cold. Belmore Heights was the kind of place where driveways were longer than most city blocks and gates opened with the quiet hiss of superiority. Randall Grayson's estate was no exception. The white stone facade gleamed under moonlight, and the double doors were taller than anything meant for humans. They weren't built for shelter. They were built for impression. Jasmine and I arrived separately. She had stayed behind after the wedding with her cousins. I didn't wait. After last night, I wasn't in the mood to trail behind her like some accessory. I pulled into the circular driveway and sat there for a moment, watching my reflection in the rearview mirror. My tie was still on. My eyes still tired. There was nothing in my posture that said guest. I looked like I belonged. And still, I knew I didn't. Inside, the house smelled of imported candles and polished oak. Portraits lined the foyer. Bryce in his Princeton uniform, posing with a lacrosse stick and an overconfident smirk. Randall on the golf green, mid-swing, framed like royalty. Even one of Jasmine as a teenager, debutante sash and tiara catching the light. But nothing of us. Nothing of our wedding, our anniversary, the 10 years we'd spent weaving a life together. It was like I was the unspoken footnote to her glossy biography. A maid nodded at me politely as I made my way upstairs. Jasmine's room, her old room, was still decorated in soft pastels and silver trims. Our bags had been placed there. One bed, neatly turned down. No conversation between us when she arrived. She brushed past me, eyes averted, and began removing her jewelry like it weighed too much. I changed in silence, folding my suit carefully over the edge of the armchair. We said nothing as we slipped into bed, a foot of empty air separating us like it had all year. Her back faced me. Mine faced the wall. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, sunlight poured in through the tall, arched windows like judgment. I dressed early, nothing flashy. Slacks, a crisp navy button-up, the kind of clothes that didn't invite questions. Jasmine was still in bed when I left the room, scrolling through her phone, face blank. I knew that face. It was the one she wore when pretending, and she'd been pretending for a while now. Downstairs, the Graysons were already seated at the long walnut table in the breakfast room. Randall at the head, reading something on his tablet. Bryce, hungover but still smug, sipping espresso. Jasmine's mother, Evelyn, applying her lipstick with a compact mirror like there wasn't anyone else in the room. I took the open seat farthest from Randall. The help placed a cup of black coffee in front of me. I thanked her. She didn't respond. Randall looked up after a few sips. "Still wasting time in that uniform?" he asked, not even bothering to soften the blow. Just like that. No good morning. No acknowledgement of what had happened the night before. Just a verbal jab straight to the gut, as if my career was some child's fantasy he tolerated at holidays. Bryce snorted into his toast. "Hey, Dad, maybe he'll finally retire and get a real job. Something like marketing or software sales." Jasmine entered right on cue, tying her robe at the waist. She caught the tail end of the joke and smirked. "Oh, leave him alone," she said casually. "Some people like being underpaid and overranked." Her voice was syrupy, not even sarcastic enough to sting. Just flat. Familiar. She said it like she'd said it 100 times before. A script. A tone. The perfect way to make me feel like a shadow. I sipped my coffee without reacting. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Not anymore. Because I knew something they didn't. And that secret, that quiet, simmering truth, gave me a strength they couldn't see. It made their arrogance feel small. I leaned back slightly in my chair, watching them move through their morning like everything was normal. Bryce talked about an upcoming investor meeting for Grayson Partners. Randall ranted about a defense contract Arkwell Systems had been stalling on. Jasmine chimed in now and then with some half-formed opinion, earning nods for parroting things her father said. I was invisible, yes, but I was listening. Every word they said sharpened the outline of the plan already in motion. What they didn't know, what none of them even considered, was that in less than a week, Randall Grayson and his polished boardroom would be standing across from me. Not as their son-in-law, not as some forgotten soldier, but as the Pentagon-appointed senior liaison overseeing the very contract they were salivating to close. That Arkwell Systems meeting Bryce kept bragging about? I was the surprise waiting at the end of that table. Every prep file he'd scanned, every slideshow Jasmine helped organize as part of her internship with her father's firm, those documents would land on my desk first. I already had the security clearance. I already had the authority. I had been working with Arkwell for months. They just didn't know the name attached to the role. Yet, they thought power came in wine cellars and company cars, in black cards and golf memberships. But real power, quiet power, moved beneath the surface. Real power didn't shout. It signed clearance forms and sealed budgets. It showed up in full dress blues and shook the world without raising its voice. Big week ahead, Randall said to no one in particular, stabbing a piece of fruit with his fork. Arkwell makes their decision Monday. Once that deal lands, we're going national. Expansion, tech development, you name it. Jasmine's eyes lit up. You think they'll take it? She asked. Bryce nodded confidently. They'd be stupid not to. I smiled into my coffee. Just faintly. Just enough to feel the weight of what was coming. I'm sure they'll be impressed, I said. Randall looked up briefly, as if just remembering I was there. You know anything about Arkwell, son? He asked. I held his gaze. More than you think. He laughed lightly and shook his head. Doubt it. But I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because in 5 days, that laugh would be gone. I wasn't always invisible. That's the part they never considered. Before Jasmine's family decided to treat me like some novelty with dog tags, before they dismissed every accomplishment stitched onto my chest like it was costume jewelry, I had a name, a presence, a legacy already forming. I graduated first in my class at West Point, top marks in cyber systems and field leadership. Johns Hopkins gave me the second degree that built my reputation. A master's in cyber warfare with a thesis that now sits classified in a black vault buried beneath Arlington. My service wasn't spent polishing medals or giving speeches at parades. It was spent watching digital ghosts move through fiber and code, catching threats in the bloodstream of a nation that didn't know how close it came to bleeding. But to the Graysons, a man in uniform was still just a mascot, something to clap for on Veterans Day, then joke about the rest of the year. They saw combat boots and heard poverty. They saw discipline and read it as desperation. They measured success in stock portfolios and luxury vacations, never understanding that while they bought security systems, men like me dismantled threats that would turn those systems to ash. I never corrected them. Not once. Because truth doesn't need applause to be real. And power, real power, waits. My office calendar buzzed as I sipped the last of my morning espresso. Monday. Arkwell Systems. Boardroom briefing. Jasmine had no idea what that meeting really meant, even though she'd helped her father prep for it all week. She thought I was off to some routine Pentagon rotation, maybe filing reports, attending a few strategic sessions on drone policy or civilian tech contracts. She never asked specifics. She never really wanted to know. My job order, she once said. You don't do anything I can show off, were her exact words. But Monday wasn't about reports. It was about contracts. And not just any contracts, defense contracts worth 9 figures. Contracts that determined which firms would become the next decade's backbone of cybersecurity infrastructure. Contracts I would oversee. The irony made me smirk. Jasmine, her father, Bryce, everyone in that mansion had been talking about Arkwell like it was their golden goose. Bryce called it the future of Grayson expansion, and Randall even joked that after the deal, they might buy a little island and let Jasmine pick which side of the ocean she wants to own. Their plan, as I understood it, was to take the Arkwell partnership and turn it into a launchpad for a larger private tech security firm. They were already courting secondary investors, and Jasmine had been bragging about a potential advisory role once the board approved. None of them knew that the final eyes on the contract, the only eyes that mattered, were mine. I had been working with the Department of Defense for months, quietly coordinating a review of Arkwell's development roadmap, existing capabilities, and vendor relationships. I had sat in on 2 closed-door sessions with the chairman of Arkwell himself. When they needed someone to assign final approval authority from the Pentagon side, someone with technical fluency and the right clearances, my name came up. Not because of politics, not because of charm, but because I'd earned it. Monday would be the first time I stood in that boardroom. The Graysons didn't know I was coming. I'd requested anonymity in the review process until the final day, something the Pentagon preferred in high-value assessments. And when I walked into that room, in full dress blues, every star and stripe in place, it wouldn't be as Jasmine's husband. It would be as the man holding the weight of the decision they thought they had already won. I leaned back in my chair, flipping through the preliminary files one more time. Bryce had submitted his department's proposed allocation strategy. Sloppy. Inflated numbers, fuzzy logic around equipment costs, and a disturbing lack of cybersecurity testing benchmarks. It wasn't fraud, at least not yet, but it was arrogant. Randall's executive summary leaned heavy on legacy and light on substance. "We are the only name that matters," he wrote. "No supporting data. Just ego. That kind of thing doesn't hold up in front of a military committee." But they'd never had to answer to someone who knew what a firewall breach actually meant or how long it took for a zero-day exploit to wipe out a city's electrical grid. They'd never been questioned by someone who understood defense not as a budget item, but as blood. My phone buzzed again. A text from Jasmine. "Dinner tonight at Orlov's with Dad and Bryce. Please don't bail." I didn't reply. Let her sit in that silence. Let her wonder for once where I was, what I was planning, how much of me she actually knew. The truth is, she'd grown too used to my absence being convenient. I had become her +1 in title only, the man who showed up clean-shaven to fundraisers, nodded at the right moments, and vanished without complaint when her family needed the spotlight to shine uninterrupted. But I never stopped being the man who built himself from nothing. I just stopped showing it. I stood, tugging at the cuff of my shirt. The suit was regulation clean, sharp, designed to blend in. But next Monday, I wouldn't be blending in. I would be commanding the room. Not with theatrics, not with ego, just presence. Jasmine once said I didn't know how to take control, that I was too passive, too polite. She had no idea that passivity was a shield, and when I chose to drop it, I didn't shout. I executed. I moved through the rest of the day with quiet precision, finalizing notes, uploading analysis documents, reviewing the schedule with my team. Everyone was on alert for Monday. The briefing would last 90 minutes. Arkwell's leadership would sit at the head of the room, but I would stand. Jasmine would be there too, likely seated beside Randall, maybe Bryce, maybe someone from the legal team. She'd be wearing something sleek, something understated. She'd be smiling, assuming the role she'd played her entire life. But she wouldn't be ready for me. And that was the part one kept returning to. Not revenge, not vindication, but visibility. For the first time, they would see me not as a quiet man in a suit. Not as the husband who tagged along or the military man they laughed about behind fluted glasses, but as the architect of the very thing they desired, the gatekeeper. So I sat back down and typed a single line in the prep document, an instruction to my assistant to finalize Monday's credentials list. Below the header marked Authority and Clearance, I added my name, Major General Marshall T. Reed, Cybercom Senior Liaison, DoD Directive 5000. It looked right there. Not flashy, not loud. Just true. After the third toast and second jab at my rank, I'd had enough. Bryce was telling a story about some botched military project, something he clearly didn't understand but was mocking anyway. And right on cue, he looked at me, smirked, and lifted his glass. "Shouldn't you be out saluting someone instead of drinking champagne?" His voice carried, smooth and rehearsed, like he'd waited all evening to deliver that line. I looked at Jasmine. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Just sipped her wine and smiled faintly at her brother like he'd just told a joke worth repeating. Her father, Randall, chuckled into his napkin. Evelyn, her mother, murmured something about how even soldiers need to unwind. I wasn't unwinding. I was enduring. There's a difference. I didn't react. Didn't toss the champagne back in protest or fire a clever line across the table. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside the untouched dessert plate in front of me, and stood, quietly, like a man leaving the table for something more important than small talk and status games. I'll head out, I said. Jasmine didn't ask where. No one did. Bryce saluted mockingly as I stepped away. Take care, General. It was the first time he'd used the title. Even then, it sounded like a taunt. I walked out of the estate, the night air heavier than it should have been. Belmore Heights was always too quiet, like the trees had signed non-disclosure agreements. The driveway curved like a question I was tired of answering. My car sat under a security light that buzzed faintly overhead. I slipped inside, shut the door, and for the first time that night, breathed. The silence in the car was pure, unfiltered. I didn't need to perform here. I loosened my tie and stared at the dashboard, hands resting on the steering wheel like it was some kind of anchor. I could have driven home, back to our shared house filled with pictures that told a better story than the truth. But I didn't. I didn't want to walk through that door and pretend the night hadn't happened. That Bryce's words were harmless. That Jasmine's silence didn't sting. I didn't want to sleep in a bed next to someone who could laugh at my expense, then kiss me like it never happened. Instead, I drove to the base, 27 minutes away, past neighborhoods that didn't care who I was, through intersections where no one knew my name. The gate guards recognized me the moment I rolled in, offered a nod. Welcome back, sir. That felt more genuine than anything I'd heard from my in-laws in years. I didn't stop at my office. I didn't go to the officers' quarters. I found a quiet spot in the back lot near the training field and parked. The air was cold. The kind of cold that makes your lungs remember you're alive. I changed out of the tuxedo in the car, carefully unbuttoning the shirt that had never really fit right, shrugging off the jacket Jasmine had insisted I wear. From my duffel in the back seat, I pulled on my uniform. Not full dress, just the fatigues. The real ones. The ones that smelled like sweat and silence and purpose. I felt more like myself in 10 seconds than I had all night. I leaned the seat back and stared at the roof of the car. Sleep didn't come quickly, but I didn't fight it. My body was exhausted. Not from work, but from pretending. Pretending to belong. Pretending to laugh. Pretending that tonight wasn't just the latest in a long line of slights. The seat wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. Cold metal wrapped around me like armor. No polished marble. No gilded chandeliers. Just me, the hum of security lights, and the distant sound of a flag whipping against a pole in the wind. But I didn't just lie there. I had work to do. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the file packet I'd been building for weeks, classified notes, logistical breakdowns, cross-departmental assessments on Arkwell's capabilities. I flipped through every page, making small edits, adding margin notes, circling key data points. I reviewed Bryce's numbers again. Sloppy. Overconfident. He assumed no one would question them. I would. My laptop glowed beside me. I plugged in the secure drive and began finalizing the presentation. Arkwell's chairman had given me carte blanche on how to approach the review session. Monday, I'd be standing in front of not just the board, but everyone Bryce had invited to show off to, including Jasmine. I wouldn't embarrass them. That's not who I am. But I wouldn't hide either. There's something about preparing for a battle, any kind, even one in a suit, that sharpens the mind. I worked until dawn began cracking across the horizon. The car windows fogged with my breath. The silence outside was still thick, but inside, I was clearer than I'd been in months. By 6 a.m., I had everything I needed. The final version of the report was ready. The encrypted deck was uploaded to the secure cloud. All I had left to do was walk in on Monday, dressed in what they thought made me small, and remind them why power doesn't always announce itself. As I closed the laptop and sat back, I thought about Jasmine again, about how she used to look at me when we first met. Before the career grew heavy with responsibility, before the medals, before the politics, back when she saw the man, not the uniform. Somewhere along the way, that gaze faded, replaced by performance, by social climbing, by expectation, and I'd let it. I'd let them all build this version of me they could mock or ignore because it was easier than demanding they see the truth. But that ends now. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger is short-sighted. I was focused. Still. Cold. Maybe. But not bitter. Monday would come. The boardroom would fill. And when I stepped inside, I wouldn't have to speak loudly to be heard. I'd show them who I was. And I wouldn't need a single apology to do it. Monday came with the clarity of mission. No hesitation. No half measures. The suit stayed in the closet. I wore my dress blues, the full uniform, polished to precision, medals aligned, ribbons gleaming like quiet thunder. I didn't wear them for show. I wore them because today wasn't about reminding anyone who I was. It was about making sure they finally saw it. The car ride to the Arkwell Systems Executive Tower was quiet, just the rhythmic beat of tires on asphalt and the occasional low crackle of the security radio. My assistant, Lieutenant Langston, rode with me, files tucked in a briefcase between us. We didn't speak much. He knew what the day was, knew what was coming. We'd been prepping for this moment for weeks. Every stat, every projection, every flaw in Randall Grayson's numbers marked and cataloged like targets on a grid. The tower itself rose like steel ambition, 32 floors of glass and nerve. The kind of building built to impress investors and remind visitors they didn't belong. Except today, I belonged more than anyone inside it. Jasmine's father, her brother Bryce, her uncle. Hell, even Jasmine herself. They'd all be waiting in the top-floor boardroom, waiting to make their pitch, waiting to impress the liaison from the Department of Defense. They just didn't know the man they'd been brushing off for years was that liaison. Security didn't slow me down. My badge cleared us through every checkpoint, and the front desk receptionist's eyes widened when she read my rank. "Good morning, Major General Reed," she said, standing automatically. "Boardroom's ready for you, sir." Elevators unlocked. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't need to. The uniform did all the talking. Up the elevator we went, silent but full of momentum. Floor after floor ticked past until we hit 32. The doors opened into a long corridor of black marble, floor-to-ceiling windows on one side and walnut paneling on the other. At the end stood the boardroom doors, already ajar, already buzzing with voices. I walked in. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. At the head of the room, Arkwell's chairman, Malcolm Trent, stood with a smile already forming. "Good morning, Major General Reed," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "We're honored to have you here." Every eye turned. Bryce's pen froze in his hand. Randall's expression faltered, half smile, half confusion, like his brain couldn't piece together what his eyes were screaming. Jasmine's mouth parted slightly, a whisper of breath escaping her lips as she looked at me not like a husband, but like a stranger. "Gentlemen," I said, nodding to the board. "Shall we begin?" No one responded for a beat too long. Then chairs shifted, laptops were opened, and silence gave way to forced composure. I took my seat, at the head of the table. Not beside Randall. Not in the shadows. Front and center, where the liaison belonged. My team followed suit, quietly taking positions at the corners of the room. Lieutenant Langston placed the briefcase on the table and distributed tablets with preloaded files. Everything was surgical. "Let's begin with an overview of the submitted proposal," I said. My voice was steady, neutral, but firm. "There are a few key areas that require clarification." Bryce was still staring at me, face pale, posture rigid. Randall cleared his throat, finally finding the nerve to speak. "Marshal, I didn't realize you'd be the one overseeing this." His tone was somewhere between nervous and offended, like a man trying to regain his footing after the floor gave out. "I know," I replied evenly. "That was intentional." He blinked. I turned to the screen where my assistant had already connected the projection. "Let's talk about budget allocation first," I said. "Mr. Bryce Grayson submitted a projected resource map last week. We flagged 3 sections as problematic. The cybersecurity outlay is underdeveloped, and your R&D timeline appears optimistic to the point of being non-compliant with federal standards." Bryce tried to speak. "Well, those projections were based on preliminary estimates. Preliminary data is acceptable," I interrupted calmly. "But estimates without methodology are not. Can you walk me through your source assumptions?" His lips parted again, but nothing came out. He glanced at his tablet, flipped through pages, then mumbled, "I'd have to review that with my team." I let the silence sit, just long enough. Then I turned toward Randall. "Your executive summary leans heavily on historical relationships with defense contractors. But Arkwell is seeking a future-facing contract. We evaluate based on capability, not nostalgia." Randall shifted in his seat. "We've provided decades of reliable service to national security. Then that should be reflected in the data," I said. "Not just the branding." Jasmine was still staring. She hadn't moved. Her eyes scanned every inch of my uniform like she was trying to reconstruct a version of me she'd never taken time to know. Her fingers were curled around the edge of the table, knuckles pale. She looked like she was shrinking in her chair, not from shame, maybe, but from realization. from the weight of understanding how much he had never asked, never listened. The chairman cleared his throat. The Department of Defense has granted Major General Reed full discretionary oversight on this review, he reminded the room. All decisions related to this contract, budget approval, team integration, rollout oversight, will go through his office. My nod was small but deliberate. We moved through the agenda. I dissected every page of their presentation. Never with spite, never with personal edge. Just clarity, professionalism, precision, the very things they claimed to admire. Until they saw it staring back at them from someone they thought they could belittle. Bryce couldn't recover. Every question unraveled him further. Jasmine sat frozen. Randall's anger simmered just below his skin, but he had no foothold. Not here. Not today. When the briefing ended, the chairman stood once more. "Thank you, Major General," he said with a slight bow of respect. "We look forward to your final evaluation." I stood and gathered my materials. "You'll have it within 48 hours, I said, "assuming the follow-up documents I've requested are delivered on time." Bryce's head lowered slightly. "Yes, sir." Randall muttered a quiet, "Of course." And Jasmine? She said nothing, but her silence finally meant something. The moment I took my seat at the head of the table, the temperature in the boardroom shifted. Not physically. It was still chilled to a corporate precision. But something else, something subtler, fractured in the air. Bryce's hand, once casually twirling a pen, stilled. He looked down at the tablet in front of him like it had betrayed him. His eyes were darting, unsure where to land. Randall's face, once flushed with the arrogant glow of assumed control, went pale in a way I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not yet, but confusion. Confusion laced with something raw, loss. Jasmine, across the table, didn't blink. Her mouth was slightly open, lips parted as if she had a question but didn't know the language to ask it in. I didn't wait for them to catch up. The chairman cleared his throat and stood. His voice was formal, but his eyes were sharp, trained on the Graysons with quiet satisfaction. As discussed, Major General Reed will oversee Arkwell's defense contract evaluation, he said. Full operational authority. Direct clearance from the Pentagon. Any strategic input or programmatic revisions will be directed through his office. I nodded once, then turned to the screen where the first slide had already appeared, a top-level security schematic with redacted sections removed for board access. The header read, Ghost Grid Integration Phase 1, Command Oversight Briefing. "This," I said, "is what you've asked to be part of." Nobody moved. Ghost Grid, I continued, is the Department of Defense's next-generation infrastructure for threat detection, cyber defense response, and adaptive perimeter expansion. What you've proposed, I let my eyes drift to Bryce briefly, is a support integration model that lacks redundancy and underestimates data packet stress testing by nearly 42%. Bryce coughed into his fist. "I think that number may be slightly exaggerated." I turned toward him fully. "Then please explain how your benchmark model passed simulated intrusion at only level 2 thresholds. This contract requires level 4 minimum. You proposed integration with level 1 redundancy." My tone never rose, but my words had weight. "I've read every document. If there's a methodology I missed, now's your time." He froze, looked toward his father. Randall avoided his gaze. Jasmine looked down at her notepad, though I knew she hadn't written a single word since I entered the room. Bryce tried again. "We expected incremental adjustments to the protocol. I wasn't under the impression this was a rigid requirement." I gave a quiet exhale. Not a sigh. Just air clearing space. National defense doesn't flex for impression management. The contract is precise because failure is fatal. I leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the table. "You're not pitching a software subscription, Bryce. You're offering to defend American assets from nation-state adversaries who don't care about your timeline or projections. Your model would last 7 minutes under real-world conditions." Silence. I turned to Randall. "Your budget memo forecasts a 12-month implementation phase. What resources are you planning to deploy that haven't been accounted for in your asset roster?" Randall cleared his throat. "We've spoken with secondary vendors about support. Those vendors are under investigation for compliance violations," I said, not missing a beat. "And any contract linked to them will be flagged. You were briefed on this in last quarter's advisory. Did you review that document?" Randall's jaw tensed. "It was a long memo. I summarized it in the executive digest," I replied coolly. 5 pages. More silence. The boardroom was still full, but it felt like it was just us now, me, Jasmine, Randall, Bryce. Everyone else had faded to the periphery, spectators to a reckoning they hadn't paid to witness. The chairman gave no intervention. This was my floor. My operation. I clicked the slide forward. This contract is not about who you know or what your name is. It's about whether you can hold the line. And as it stands now, your proposal doesn't. Bryce was sweating now. Not profusely, but enough that his collar looked tighter. His pen had rolled off the table and onto the floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. I stood slowly, walked toward the presentation board, and pointed to the new schematic on screen. This is the updated model the Pentagon developed with Arkwell's core engineers. This is what we need. This is what we will fund. I turned back to them. Any company that wants to ride this wave must meet these parameters. Otherwise, they're just noise. Jasmine watched me, eyes wide, lips drawn into a line. For a second, I thought she might speak, but she didn't. She just stared, not with anger, not even with embarrassment, with awe, the kind that came too late. When I returned to my seat, I caught Randall's hand shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee. He masked it well, but not well enough. He looked smaller now, less sure. The man who once laughed about my cute little medals was staring at them now, seeing them in a new light. We'll provide revised figures, he said, voice measured. You have 48 hours, I replied. After that, we advanced to phase 2 with or without your firm's participation. The chairman nodded, clearly satisfied. We'll reconvene Wednesday, he said. Thank you, Major General. I gave a nod, stood, and began collecting my materials. My assistant followed without prompt. There was nothing left to say inside that room. The message had landed. It wasn't a power play. It was the truth, revealed, standing in full uniform and finally undeniable. As I approached the doors, I felt it, that heat at my back. I didn't have to turn to know Jasmine had risen. Her heels clicked against the hardwood like a clock ticking towards something inevitable. But I didn't stop. Not yet. Some reckonings belong in silence. She followed me into the hallway. I didn't slow down. My steps were steady, deliberate, like I was still inside that boardroom delivering the briefing. The door clicked closed behind us with a soft finality, and the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged. Electric. Every footstep she took behind me sounded like a question, but she didn't ask it until we reached the far end of the corridor. There, under a long window that overlooked the city skyline, I stopped. Not for her. For myself. I needed a breath before she said whatever was coming. You're a general? She asked, and her voice cracked just a little. Jasmine had always been composed, graceful, poised, untouchable. But now, standing there in her designer heels and perfectly tailored blouse, she looked unmoored. Like someone who had just learned the house she lived in wasn't built on stone but on glass. I turned toward her. The question didn't deserve an answer. Not really. She already knew it. Had just watched an entire boardroom rise to acknowledge it. But I gave her a nod anyway. I am. Her eyes searched mine, like she was still trying to confirm it, like there had to be some trick. Why didn't you ever tell me? She said. But it wasn't an accusation. It was bewilderment. It was the sound of a woman suddenly aware that she'd spent years married to a man she never fully looked at. I did, I said. You just didn't listen. She flinched like I'd slapped her. But I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't even looked away. I just told the truth. She blinked and took a half step back, arms folding and tied against her body. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked, keeping my tone level. You laughed with them, Jasmine. Every time Bryce made a joke about my salary. Every time your father called my job a phase. You didn't push back. You smiled and sipped your wine and let them talk about me like I was a hobby. That's not how I meant it, she said quickly, like the words might reverse what had been etched in years of silence. But it's what you allowed, I said, my voice quiet but sure. You let them shape me into something small because it was easier than standing next to something you couldn't control. She looked away then, out the window at the skyline. The silence stretched between us like a wound. I didn't rush to fill it. I learned in uniform that silence wasn't always weakness. Sometimes, it's the only way someone will finally hear themselves. When she turned back to me, her expression had shifted. Less stunned now, more searching. Why didn't you correct them? I let out a breath. Not a sigh, just an exhale weighted with everything I had swallowed over the years. Because I thought you'd see me without needing me to explain it. I thought you'd recognize the man you married. I paused. I didn't expect your family to get it, but I thought you would. She didn't speak right away. Her jaw worked slightly like she wanted to challenge me, defend herself, but nothing came. She had no case to make. Not really. And I wasn't there for an argument. I wasn't there to fight for space I had earned 10 times over. I adjusted the cuffs of my uniform, a slow, deliberate motion. Her eyes dropped to the stars on my shoulders like she was seeing them for the first time, like she didn't know how many nights I'd spent earning the right to wear them. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. But that wasn't what I needed to hear. Not today. I shook my head slowly. Love without respect isn't love, Jasmine. It's possession. It's decoration. And I've spent too many years being a fixture in your life instead of a partner. She stepped toward me, hands out slightly like she wanted to reach, but wasn't sure if she had the right. I didn't know how much you were carrying. You never. Because you never asked, I said, sharper than I meant, but not apologizing for it. You never wanted to know more than what made sense at the dinner table. You asked me to wear suits instead of my uniform when we visited. You told me to tone it down when I talked about operations. You made me small, Jasmine. And now that you've seen the full picture, now you're curious. She didn't deny it. That, at least, I respected. A long moment passed. Her voice was barely audible when she finally said, "What happens now?" I didn't answer right away. I looked past her, through the glass, down at the traffic moving far below like tiny lines of code feeding a larger machine. It reminded me how small everything looked from above, and how big it always felt when you were the one standing in it, trying to make it work. I don't know, I said finally. I'm not making any decisions today. I've got a job to do. A mission to finish. You and I. We'll talk. Maybe, but not now. She nodded, though I could tell the words stung. But I saw something else in her expression, too, something I hadn't seen in years. Humility. And maybe for the first time, understanding. I turned and walked toward the elevator. My boots echoed on the marble floor, a steady beat that didn't waver. Jasmine didn't follow. She stayed by the window, watching a man she thought she married walk away from her, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Some truths don't need to be shouted to be heard. Some goodbyes don't need doors to close. And some reckonings, like mine, don't happen in grand explosions. They happen in full uniform, without raising your voice. The apology came 3 days later. A number I didn't recognize called just after 9 at night. I was back at the base, my temporary quarters dimly lit, reports spread across the desk. The call rang twice before I picked it up, more out of habit than curiosity. "Marshall," the voice said. It was Randall. I leaned back in the chair, watching the ceiling fan turn. His voice was different now. Not the confident, corporate polish he usually wore like a suit of armor. No, this was slower. Halting, like a man realizing the floor wasn't where he thought it was. "About Monday," he continued. "I had no idea that you were leading the review." "I know," I said flatly. Silence filled the line. Then a faint sigh. "I underestimated you." "You never tried to estimate me at all." Another pause. I could practically hear him adjusting his collar. "Look, I want to make things right. Can we meet for dinner? Evelyn's making that roast you like. Jasmine will be there." I stared at the wall, at the shadow of my uniform jacket hanging near the door. The same uniform he once mocked as a costume. The same one that had shifted the ground beneath him just days ago. "I'm not interested in dinner, Randall," I said. "What you're looking for isn't a meal. You want reassurance. You want to believe this isn't as bad as it felt. I just want to show respect, properly this time." I leaned forward, letting the weight of what I'd been carrying all these years settle in my voice. "You don't fix years of dismissal with roast beef and pleasantries. You looked me in the face more times than I can count and saw nothing. Don't pretend now." He didn't reply. "Not for a long time." "Just before I hung up," he murmured. "I deserve that." Then the line clicked dead. A minute later, a text came in. "Jasmine, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Can we talk?" I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because the part of me that used to jump at those words had gone quiet. Her apology didn't carry the urgency of revelation. It felt like an admission delivered too late, like a match after the storm. What was there left to ignite? I stood and looked out the window. The base was quiet. A hum of electricity in the distance. The runway lights in the far distance blinked slowly, as if time itself was pacing. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd moved past that. What I felt now was colder. Still, a kind of distance that didn't ache, just existed. Jasmine silenced the night of the wedding, Her smirks at my expense, the way she let her family cut into me one comment at a time, they weren't isolated moments. They were a pattern. And that pattern had become the architecture of our marriage. Subtle undermining. Passive diminishment. 1,000 tiny cuts dressed up as jokes. I replayed her text in my mind. Can we talk? But what was there to say? That I'd worn my silence like armor because I'd grown tired of defending my worth? That I'd made peace with being invisible because every time I spoke, she reached for the volume knob instead of listening? That I'd stood beside her through years of polite belittling because I believed in the vows more than the atmosphere they came with? I sat down again, letting the silence of the room surround me. My fingers hovered over my phone, but I didn't type. Instead, I opened my laptop, reviewed the Arkwell follow-up documentation, and submitted my final analysis. I flagged 2 internal issues, both tied to Bryce's oversight, but recommended structural corrections instead of elimination. I could have gutted the proposal. I had the power. I had the documentation. But I didn't. Because revenge wasn't the point. Dignity was. I closed the laptop, shut off the light, and lay back on the cot. It wasn't a comfortable bed. The springs creaked and the mattress was thin. But it didn't matter. I slept better that night than I had in years. No pretending. No forced dinners. No rooms full of people who only spoke when it was time to make a punchline of me. The next day passed without any calls. No messages. No visitors. And it felt, right, like silence had finally found its proper place. Then, that evening, I returned to my house. Alone. The mail was still being delivered. The grass needed cutting. The refrigerator had a bottle of water and nothing else. But the quiet wasn't hollow. It was clean, like an airstrip cleared for something new. I walked into the study and saw the photo of Jasmine and me on our wedding day still framed on the shelf. She looked radiant. I looked proud. And yet, looking at it now, it felt like a picture of 2 people on parallel paths, smiling for the camera but walking away from each other the moment the flash went off. I didn't throw it away, but I turned it around. That night, I made dinner for one. Eggs and toast. Nothing special. But it was mine, and I ate it without thinking about whether it was impressive or elegant. It just was. Later, as I sat on the porch watching dusk fold over the street like a well-worn blanket, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Headlights off. Quiet. A soft door close. Then footsteps. Jasmine. She didn't knock. Just stood at the edge of the porch, holding something in her hands. She didn't look dressed for a scene. No makeup. Hair pulled back. Just jeans and a sweater and eyes that looked like they'd been crying long before she parked. I didn't know, she said quietly. I believe you, I replied. But knowing now doesn't erase what you chose to ignore then. She nodded, gripping the thing in her hands tighter. I brought something, she said, stepping closer. It was a folder. A thick one. She extended it to me like it was fragile. What is it? I asked. My letters, she said. Ones I started writing after Monday. Every night. I didn't send them because I didn't want to interrupt your silence. But I needed to say things. I took the folder. Didn't open it. Not yet. Read them if you want, she whispered. Or don't. I needed you to have them. I nodded once. She didn't wait for an invitation inside. She just turned and walked back to the car, pulling out slowly, leaving the night unshaken behind her. I sat with the folder on my lap. Maybe tomorrow I'd read them. Maybe not. But for the first time, I had the space to choose. The military teaches you to act, not react. Emotions are filtered through discipline, instincts reshaped by training. There's a line between feeling and function, and in my world, that line can't afford to blur. That's why I didn't retaliate when Bryce mocked me, or when Randall dismissed my work as a waste in uniform. I didn't lash out when Jasmine laughed in rooms where I was being diminished. I observed. I absorbed. Then I planned. Filing my final report to the Department of Defense wasn't an act of revenge. It was procedure. After every major review, especially one with budget implications like Arkwell's, we submit a full evaluation. I'd spent the weekend sifting through every component, cross-referencing Bryce's projections with the Arkwell engineering team's actual data. The flaws were real. Not catastrophic, but dangerous if left unchecked. And they all tracked back to his division. I didn't doctor the report. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't bury them either. What I did was simple. I told the truth. Line by line. Point by point. 2 major issues. Both tied to oversight. Both fixable, with the right leadership. And that was the part 1 let speak for itself. The DOD would take it from there. Maybe they'd push Arkwell to replace Bryce. Maybe they wouldn't. That wasn't my call. My job was to assess, not to punish. And that difference mattered to me, because a soldier doesn't seek revenge. He seeks clarity, discipline, integrity. Even when surrounded by people who wouldn't recognize those values if they came gift-wrapped with a quarterly return. I'd come to realize something over the last few weeks, something quieter than anger and sharper than grief. I didn't need them to see me anymore. Not Jasmine, not Randall, not the family that had decided I was easier to box and then understand. The truth was, I'd been measuring myself by their tape for too long. Trying to shrink who I was to fit their rooms, their expectations, their traditions. When I stopped trying, I found something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I didn't need their dinners, their congratulations, their sudden interest now that I'd proven something. I already knew who I was. I'd known it for years. Every time I deployed, every time I led a unit, every time I cracked a cyber chain designed to cripple an entire city's infrastructure. I wasn't the man they mocked. I wasn't even the one they finally saw in the boardroom. I was the one they never took the time to know. That realization didn't come like lightning. It came like a slow sunrise, inch by inch, warming places I thought would stay cold forever. I didn't stop caring overnight. I just stopped needing validation from people who offered only criticism in return. Back at the base, I settled into a rhythm that felt familiar. Secure. Mornings began early, the way they always had. PT at 0500, then strategy sessions, then contract reviews. The Arkwell case moved on without me. Once the report was filed, I was no longer in the room. That's how it works. Oversight ends. Bureaucracy continues. Bryce would answer to someone else now. Jasmine's letters remained on my desk. I hadn't opened them yet, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure what part of me still wanted to. Maybe I was waiting for the dust to settle inside me, for the heat to cool into something that could absorb her words without clouding them. She texted a few more times. Once after seeing a photo of me in uniform on Arkwell's newsletter. "You looked powerful," she wrote. I didn't respond. Another time, she simply sent, "I miss you." That one sat unread for days. I wasn't avoiding her. I just wasn't chasing the version of myself she used to love. The one who tried harder to be accepted than to be respected. Still, at night, I'd sometimes find myself glancing at that folder, wondering what she wrote, wondering if she'd admitted what I already knew, that she'd built a life that left no room for my whole self, and now she was realizing what that cost. Then, one Thursday evening, a junior officer came into my office with a delivery, a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Jasmine's. I nodded for the officer to leave and placed it gently beside the letters. This time, I opened it. Inside was a photo frame. But not just any photo. It was a still from the Arkwell boardroom, the moment I entered in full dress blues, the chairman rising to greet me. Someone must have captured it mid-motion. In the image, I wasn't smiling. I wasn't trying to impress. I just looked. Settled. Present. Behind me, you could see the blur of Bryce's startled expression, the flicker of Jasmine's shock, Randall's tight jaw. But in the center, I stood still, a man no longer underestimated. There was a note taped to the back of the frame. "I want our kids to know who their father really is. Not the version I let them see. The real one. I'm sorry." I read it twice. Then once more. It didn't undo everything. It didn't erase the years of being pushed into the margins. But it mattered. Because finally, she saw it. And more importantly, she saw me. I didn't call her that night. I didn't send a reply. I placed the frame on the shelf across from my desk, just behind my commendations. Not out of pride, but because it reminded me of a moment where truth walked into a room and sat down without apology. A few days later, one of my fellow officers invited me to speak at a local academy, high school seniors interested in military careers, STEM-focused. I agreed. I hadn't done that kind of thing in a while. Used to, I avoided anything public. Didn't want the spotlight. Didn't want to be someone's story. But now, I realized how many young men out there were still fighting to be heard in rooms that only saw their silence. When I stood before those students in uniform and told them what it meant to serve, what it meant to hold power without needing to flex it, I saw something familiar in their faces, curiosity mixed with hunger. The same hunger I'd carried into every room Jasmine's family ever sat in. They asked questions, real ones, not about money, not about rank, but about purpose. about how to lead without being liked, how to remain whole when people try to make you small. I told them the truth. You don't need the room to applaud you. You need to know you belong whether they clap or not. Afterward, a student came up to me and asked, "Sir, has anyone ever underestimated you?" I laughed once, quietly, and said, "Almost everyone." But it never changed the outcome. He nodded like that was the answer he'd hoped for. That night, back at home, I finally opened Jasmine's first letter. It was dated the night after the Arkwell meeting. Her handwriting wavered at first, then grew steadier. She didn't beg. She didn't excuse. She owned every silence, every laugh, every moment she let the world around her treat me like I didn't matter. She ended the letter with a line that stayed with me longer than anything else. "I spent so long looking past you. I forgot to look at you. And now that I finally have, I'm scared I'm too late." I folded the letter, returned it to the envelope, and placed it back in the folder. Not out of dismissal, but preservation. Some bridges burn, others hold, and a few sit quietly, waiting to see if both ends are willing to walk toward each other again. I didn't know which ours would be. But I knew this much: I wouldn't walk back as a shadow. If we rebuilt, it would be with light. Months passed. The world didn't stop. Boardrooms filled. Contracts moved forward. Uniforms were pressed. Bases rotated command. Life, in its quiet relentlessness, kept flowing. But inside, something had finally settled in me. I wasn't waiting anymore for acknowledgement, for clarity, for Jasmine. I was living as I was meant to, fully, firmly, and on my own terms. The work didn't slow. If anything, my calendar grew heavier. Briefings, strategy sessions, remote evaluations, even a few quiet consultations with firms that had once tried to undercut my authority. Funny how the room tilts when people know your name now. But I didn't gloat. That wasn't the point. Every meeting I led was about mission, not ego. Discipline, not domination. I kept showing up as the man I had always been. The only difference now? People finally saw him. Jasmine continued sending letters. Not every day. Not desperate. Just steady. Honest. Some were reflections. Some were memories. One was a copy of a children's book we once said we'd read to our future kids, annotated in the margins with her thoughts. I didn't answer. I didn't send them back. I just read them, slowly, deliberately, letting each one show me who she was now, someone different, maybe. Or someone reaching toward a version of herself I had glimpsed before all the noise buried her. Then one afternoon, I came home to find her waiting. Not on the porch. Not in the driveway. Inside. She had a key, of course. The door hadn't been changed. But the silence with which she sat in the living room, hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning the photos on the wall, that told me this wasn't an ambush. This was a request. She stood when I entered. Not hurried. Not overly apologetic. Just present. "Hey," she said. I didn't smile. But I didn't turn away either. "You should have called," I said. "I thought you'd say no," she replied, then paused. But I needed to say something. In person. I waited. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small frame wrapped in cloth. "It's not much," she said, "but it's the one thing I always regretted not making space for." When she unwrapped it, I saw the photo, me, in uniform, standing outside the Pentagon with my unit after a successful operation 2 years ago. The original had been buried in a drawer. I never displayed it. Too many moments had felt too easily dismissed. But this frame? It was clean, walnut, engraved at the bottom with one simple line: "For the man who protects even when unseen." "I want it on our wall," she said. "Not because I'm trying to fix everything, but because it should have been there from the beginning." I looked at her, not just the words, but the face behind them. There was no performance, no plea, just something quiet, something vulnerable. I took the frame. "You always said you'd rather be respected than loved," she whispered. "But you deserve both." I set the frame down gently on the entryway table. "And now?" I asked. She swallowed, then took a breath. "Now I'm trying to rebuild the kind of love that doesn't shrink the person it's attached to." There it was. Not a clean slate, but an honest one. We didn't hug. We didn't fall into each other. We just stood there, facing what was left between us. An open question neither of us rushed to answer. "Would you like coffee?" I asked finally. She blinked. "Yes, I'd like that." We walked into the kitchen, slow and silent, two people who had been through a war they never declared, but finally stopped pretending wasn't happening. As the kettle boiled, I glanced at the shelf across from the window, where her photo frame now stood beside my commendations. Not behind them, not in their shadow. Beside, I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if we'd find our way back fully, or just far enough to understand each other again. But I knew this. I would never be invisible again. Not to her. Not to anyone. And if we rebuilt this house, this marriage, it would be with new bricks. Ones forged from truth, mutual respect, and the knowledge that love, real love, doesn't require silence. It simply requires being seen.